Stephanie Muravchik, welcome to the Inquiring Mind Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me today, Stanley.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. We have a lot to discuss. I really enjoyed it. I feel like I learned a lot from your book, Trump's Democrats. Um, so before we get started, can you please tell the audience a little bit about how you came to write this book, your career as a whole, and your time as a historian and as a researcher?
Sure. Well, I'm trained as a historian. I'm a social and political historian, and my first book was in sort of religious political culture in the mid 20th century. But on the November 8th or whatever it was, 2016, I was sitting at home like everyone else was, watching the returns come in, and I was refreshing my laptop, refreshing, and just sat there stunned as what many people thought, perhaps most people thought couldn't happen, did happen. And that really got my wheels spinning, like lots of people sort of scratching our heads, wondering what happened. My husband, John Shields, is a political scientist. And so we were spending a lot of time trying to hash it out as we were reading what data was coming in after the election. One thing that really stood out was that Trump had managed to flip all of these Democratic strongholds. And that seemed even more strange to us because, of course, we live in a college town, and the Democrats that we knew were, filled with rage and terror at the prospect of his presidency. And yet there was clearly many Democrats around the country who didn't feel that way, or at least a substantial chunk of them. And so we decided it would be just really interesting to go and try to make sense of this phenomenon by getting to know who these people were. And so this was a little bit different than the work I had done previously, but it seems so tantalizing and such a neat way to get to sort of know my fellow countrymen, who I thought I knew better than I guess I did, we decided to launch this project and go spend some time living in these sort of flipped communities and trying to make sense of what had happened.
Right. And what was really interesting to me is, as you just mentioned, the disconnect between I would call them urban Democrats, so people that live in the big cities. That I live in New York City, so everyone was crying and upset, and classes were canceled. I was in college at the time, so it was a little bizarre in New York City. But so there's that reaction, and then there are obviously the more rural Democrats and the type of Democrats you're describing. What is the disconnect between the two that you noticed in your research?
Well, so there is this one emerging piece of our politics has been this increasing educational polarization, and actually decreasing even racial polarization. But you particularly see the educational polarization among white voters, and it was very strong in 2016. And so the places that we went, we decided that we wanted a variety of places. And we looked for places in different kinds of these Democratic communities that were not college towns, were not sort of vibrant urban metro centers like New York City or San Francisco or Los Angeles or Charlottesville, Virginia, or anything like that, which is a thriving college town. We went to a rural county in Kentucky, in the eastern part of Kentucky. We went to a sort of post-industrial city in southeast Iowa called Ottumwa, Iowa. And I think actually Tom Arnold came from Ottumwa, Iowa, and some of the Roseanne show. I don't know if this was before your time, but the Roseanne show is actually based on their experiences in this white working class city, sort of gritty industrial city with of a Southeast Iowa. And then we actually went to a small city right adjacent to Providence, Rhode Island. It's a very suburban style city. And so these were all different. What they had in common was they weren't Boston, New York, or the community college, the college communities. And they had in common that they tended to be fairly white, with limited diversity and limited immigration. Ottumwa had the most. Some meatpacking plants there had attracted a lot of Latino immigrants into the city. But Elliott County, for example, had effectively no Latino residents. That was in the Kentucky. So they tended to be pretty white places. And they tended to be places where most of these white voters had a lower than average percentage of them were college educated. So it tended to be a much more white working class area. And that's what I think in particular, those two things sort of distinguish, at least that's the most basic demographic difference that was clearly important to the politics that followed.
Yeah, and another sort of building on your point, one of the things I noticed is that as of the last few election cycles, we have emphasized this educated versus non-educated population. What are some of the biggest differences between the quote unquote educated and the non-educated? I
think so. This really gets at some of the heart of what we were trying to do. A lot of the research, including survey research, which is very helpful, of course, when you're trying to make sense of who's doing what in the electorate. But a lot of it tends to assume that people are sort of discrete little bubbles, and they are all making these decisions sort of independently of one another, and doesn't really take community or culture seriously. And we really wanted to take it seriously, which is why we didn't just go and do some interviews or a survey. What we wanted to do was see people in our natural habitat, sort of interacting with each other, having conversations, and trying to make sense of how people as communities were making sense of the larger political world. So we went and we interviewed a lot of people, but we also just spent a lot of time in these areas, not just talking to people in all different parts of the community, but also going to church services and I went to a dulcimer practice in Kentucky, going to town meetings, that kind of thing. And the question was why were these communities interpreting Donald Trump so differently than the Democrats that are familiar to you and I from where we live. And we came away with a few big findings. And one of them is that the communities that we got to know all are very familiar with Trump. In other words, they're familiar with Trumpy politicians and political culture. So even though to someone like myself, maybe to you or people you know, he was very shocking. He broke a lot of political norms. There are many little mini Trumps running around America in these smaller sort of out of the way localities, in these little rural counties, or these sort of post-industrial towns in the Midwest, which was so important, of course, to in the Great Lakes region, important to Trump's victory. In all three of the communities, there had been or had been a recent history of kind of a boss politics style. And these local men were Trumpy in the sense that they were brazen, they were combative, their style was very combative. They were very crude. They tended to be often nepotistic. They tended to be, some of them, not all of them, but some of them were corrupt. But they were all beloved, widely popular figures in their respective communities, precisely for these traits. And so, for example, currently in Johnston, Rhode Island, there is a mayor named Mayor Joe Policina. He's been in office now for quite a few, I can't quite remember how many election cycles, but for quite a long time. He usually wins with an overwhelming majority of the vote. And when we asked him to describe his political style, he said, when it comes to politics, I'm kind of like a street fighter. Because when people take when people take shots at you, you can't lie down, and you got to punch back. And we said, well, what happens if you don't? And he said, well, then they'll just think you're weak and they'll roll over you. And so this was kind of, now Policina is a very clean politician. He doesn't fit every categorization I just said. But there is, but he's very much has the kind of personalism of a boss politician. And that's something that's important in all of these different communities, which is these boss politicians have forged a very kind of personal relationship with voters. And they, so for example, in Elliott County, Kentucky, there had been a county executive. They call it a judge executive in county, but it's basically an elected executive position, not a judge. They call it judge. He had been in power for about 30 years he was first elected in the 70s and held power most of the time until about 2011 in this little county. And he said to me, I was a father to this county. I was a brother to this county. And he really described this kind of personal relationship with voters in the county that that he would, when he first started out, he got himself plugged into the unions, and not even unions that he was part of, but he became an agent and began to get people jobs. And by the time, toward the end of his long reign, he was sometimes referred to as King David, the way he could help people out was that he could get them loads of free gravel. And in this rural county, everybody needs gravel because they have these little roads on their farms that link them to the main arteries. And someone went to the feds and said, look, he's giving out public gravel as a kind of quid pro quo for voting for him. And so they came down on him, and he ended up, there was a prosecution. He ended up having a plea deal where he had to forswear ever running again. He had to resign, of course, and then he had to swear he would never try to run again. But when I asked people in the county, what do you think of him? He was still very popular. And one woman said to me, well, I know the government went after him, but if the county isn't helping you with your gravel, then what's it doing? Like, they could not understand at all why this was, why he had been attacked for this. So that's one, I think it's important to understand people in our kind of democratic communities tend to have a very different civic education and imagination. We tend to be very national focused and very cosmopolitan. And that distinguishes us from the people in these communities that tend to have a very local focus. That's where their civic education and imagination and identity is formed. And partly it's this familiarity with these very Trumpy figures in their own lives.
And how did you, when you and your husband did this research, how did you build trust in these neighborhoods? Because in these places, because it seems to me one of the maybe genuine concerns, and I think you outlined this in your book, is that they view outsiders, especially in Kentucky, if I'm not mistaken, they viewed outsiders as very kind of dangerous, and they kind of didn't trust them oftentimes because a lot of researchers come into those places to almost see the, you know, I hate this, it almost sounds like monkeys in the jungle, right? Like how to observe their behavior, and then they judge them from afar, call them rednecks and whatever. And they didn't want to be perceived as that. How did you go about building that kind of trust and making sure that they didn't view you and your husband that way?
Yeah, so the three places were different, but so in a place like in Johnston, which is very shaped by Johnston, very proud of the fact that about half of its residents have an Italian American heritage, and they it's a kind of culture that's probably familiar to New York, to New Yorkers, which is this sort of white ethnic culture from the Northeast Corridor, and they were like, oh, glad somebody is here and asking my opinion. Let me tell you what this country needs. So they were very friendly and open. So it wasn't so difficult to there. Ottumwa a little less so, but not so hard. But Kentucky was very different for exactly the reasons that you very much nicely portrayed. You know, there is a long tradition of mocking, of sort of outsiders coming in and either mocking or just badly misunderstanding people in the Appalachian region. And it's one of the last sort of acceptable prejudices, I think. And I mean, I wouldn't say it's acceptable, but sort of in polite company. So they were distrustful, and it took me a while to get enough people to trust me. I think I had to, you know, early on, this one woman who was a retired teacher, a very sort of elegant woman with a kind of very dignified pose, and someone who's very interested in art and nature. And she looked at me very pointedly at one moment early on, and she said, now you seem like a nice person, but you're not going to go and write that we're all a bunch of toothless, barefoot hillbillies, are you? And I really took that warning to heart, not because that was my intention ever, but simply because it made me sensitive to the fact that that was going to be an issue I'd have to deal with. In all of these places, the first thing we did was just try to get to know some people. This is a very common ethnographic technique. You know, we sometimes we got to know some elites in terms of like local journalists, local office holders who might introduce us to a few other people, and let them get to know us as much as we got to know them, you know, so they had some sense of who we were. And then, and that was especially true in Kentucky. In fact, I wrote a little letter to people that I had photocopied, sort of almost not a resume really, but just like, you know, here is who I am. This is where I come from. You know, I'm a historian. I teach at Claremont McKenna College. At that time, I was teaching at a different school. And this is my family. This is where I live. This is what I'm interested in. And I would just hand that out like campaign literature almost. And even to people that didn't seem like they would talk to me at all, I just said, that's okay. I'm bumbling around in your community. Here's so you know what I'm up to exactly. And so then I have at the time I had like, I don't know, he was like an 8-year-old son when we started this research, and he was missing me. And so I thought, you know what, I'll bring him, and then he won't miss mom, but also then people will see me in a much more human light. I'm a person, and And so I think I made a lot of effort to explain to people that I had no intention of singling out Appalachian people. And in fact, that I was most interested in what they might have in common with people in Providence, Rhode Island area, or in Ottumwa, Iowa, and not what made them different from other Americans, but actually what made them similar to a lot of Democrats throughout the country. So eventually, through different ways like that, I was able to build up enough trust and enough people to really get a lot of interesting chances to interview people, but also to observe people and just sort of be a fly on the wall in different community moments.
And were there any common places to meet up for people that were interested in politics or politically active, where they maybe it was a restaurant or a bar or whatnot, and they met up and discuss the topics of the day, where you can go out and talk to them? Or did you? I'm very curious about the work, because it's interesting to me how it's hard to picture what you do. Like, obviously you put it,
Sure.
you put pen to paper in your book, but it's so. I always try to picture if somebody tried to come up to me and be like, "Oh, I would like to get to know you," I wouldn't know how to react, and
Yes.
I could only imagine what that's like. One, from your point of view, and from the point of view of the person you're trying to talk to. So how did you directly go about talking to regular folks?
Right. I think what you just said is a great point, because, of course, and it's something it took me a while to tune into. How would one feel if one was being put on camera and asked opinions, or I wasn't putting people on camera, but being sort of recorded in some way, and being asked opinions that might be published that you might not want to share with everybody that you interact with. So, for example, I found that, there was, in the wake of the Trump election, there was journalists that had come in, and there was a man who told me that the journalist came to the coffee shop, the diner that he was sitting in, and they got him on camera saying he had voted for Trump. And these were Democratic strongholds. These are places where most people had voted Democratic, going back to Reagan, or to going back to Nixon, or even going back to Eisenhower. They had voted Democratic, and Elliott County had never voted Democratic in its entire history since the Civil War.
Republican, you mean? Right? They never
voted.
voted
I'm
for
sorry. Did I just flip it? They had never voted Republican. Thank you.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah,
They had never, right. I should flip. They had never voted Republican. That makes more sense. Back to Reagan, Nixon, Eisenhower, or ever. Thank you. So there were these, so here was this man. He said the journalist came in, and I told him I voted for Trump and I like Trump. And they put it in the news. And that night I got this angry call from my favorite aunt and my uncle, and they were so mad at me. And so what the journalists don't realize is what they're pushing people to say in public. The journalist leaves, but they've got to have conversations with these neighbors, and that go on and on. And people were, for good reason, were careful. But one thing, that there was sort of hubs in some of these places, and that was part of how we talked to people and met people. It was particularly true in Johnston. There was a coffee shop called Brewed Awakenings, where sort of everybody knows to go. And they serve good coffee and, breakfast. And a lot of people would just, particularly retirees, would just come. They had, time on their hands, and it would kind of be the place to go in the morning. You get your coffee and you see your buddies. And so we did spend a lot of time there, and a lot of politicians come through there. There was a few other restaurants and coffee shops, but Brewed Awakenings was important. In Elliott County, there was the Frosty Freeze, which is just, they don't have much there, but they have, it's a little diner, or the Penny Mart. I think the Frosty Freeze sadly just burned down a month ago. But it's a very, it was a very little diner. But also there's a lovely motel. It's the only motel in town And this motel in Elliott County had a little lobby that was very comfortable. And people would sort of come in and out of the lobby even and just chat. And it kind of, even though it was a motel, I mean, local residents would sort of come in and out and have all kinds of conversations about what was going on, just sort of share the local gossip kind of thing. So that was less true, I think, in Ottumwa, that there was, it's a much bigger city, that there was a single sort of hub. More true for the other places. But a lot of it was word of mouth. We would meet someone who would then try to introduce us to someone. And if that person was open to talking, then they might introduce us to a third person, and it would kind of snowball that way.
Yeah. So what I noticed after the election, especially, being where I am and reading the news, I think there was a point for the first, I want to say, couple of months after Trump got elected, that people had a genuine curiosity as to how the hell did this happen. And, the New York Times hired more journalists to kind of explore how this happened, why this happened. And then it seemed to just stop, right? And we were left with these kind of surface level explanations, and a lot of people will attribute it to different factors. The one thing that was a little baffling to me is the conversation about race, right? So it's the fact that, we were tired of having our first Black president, so we went back to the status quo and got another white guy. That argument never kind of resonated with me for multiple reasons. One, if you look at the Republican, the candidates for the presidency, there were, people of different demographics. So you could have elected, maybe Marco Rubio or, whomever. So they weren't white guys. Right. But this guy wasn't your typical, Trump wasn't your typical white guy. And so that never resonated with me. But the other factor is the fact that these places that you're describing voted for the first African-American president twice.
Right.
And if they were really so racially conscious, or they cared that much about the president's race, they wouldn't elect Barack Obama twice. So why did that become such a big reason for people thinking that Trump got elected?
Well, I think one thing that's, of course, race is always a piece of American politics, or at least it has been. And I'm not saying these people were not racist. I don't think we had a great ability to sort of assess that. I don't think but I think that the conversation about race doesn't account for the fact that, as you very rightly point out, these were places where these communities, a majority of voters in these communities had voted twice for Obama. And I think that it tends to obscure a really important thing, which is class. That if the focus is on race, it helps distract people who live in economically thriving, more upper class areas from the real class story. And I think it was the class story that really mattered to these people. There was certainly, particularly in a place like Ottumwa, where there had been this very rapid, large influx of Latino immigrants into the city to take jobs in these meatpacking plant that they have there, and that had caused some friction. But in it wasn't as obvious, I think, it certainly didn't make a lot of sense in a place like Kentucky or in Elliott County, Kentucky, where there was no in-migration there was no unsettling of a sort of white demographic. That was another kind of version of the story often. But what they were all tuning into was a feeling that the professional class was thriving and kind of alienating. And by, alienating to them, while they felt like they were being sort of neglected, ignored, left behind. These are all places, all three of them, very typical of these sort of Obama-Trump counties that have suffered the communities are under real economic and existential threat. They're places where there's, higher unemployment, business failures, foreclosures, and then with that come opioid addiction, family breakdown. One of the most poignant signs of this was in Appalachia. As you drive around at any given stop sign, there's this thicket of signs all year round advertising the need for foster families to sign up, because the meth epidemic there has created so many children in need of care, of foster care outside their homes. And so these are all places that have been sort of neglected by or left out of the economic growth of areas like New York, or where I live, Claremont. And what Trump was able to do really well was to give voters in these areas a feeling of social proximity, as if he were a kind of working class president. And a lot of people in my circle said, that doesn't make any sense. He's a rich guy. How could this guy with a gold spoon in his mouth? He was not a self-made man, and he's certainly not a working class guy. But for them, he was able to signal his social proximity and his sympathy with working class voters a few different ways. One is through this mimicking this boss style politics, where he goes into, he doesn't talk about broad policy. Instead, he goes to, I think, Youngstown, Ohio in the campaign and says, I'm going to make some calls and make sure that we don't close these plants. So don't move, don't sell your homes. If you listen, he often talks about taking care of someone, taking care of my people. He was deriding Biden in the lead up to the 2020 election, and he was in Pennsylvania, I think, and he said he didn't take care of you. He left you for another state. It's almost this family metaphor, right? Like a husband walking out on his wife. He left you for another, and you're like, is it woman? No, state. And it's this idea of this sort of patron kind of boss style politics, wonderfully captured actually when the first set of stimulus checks came out. And I don't know if you remember that he wanted to sign them. And there was this stupid kerfluffle, like, could he sign them? Like, it's not his, that's not how this works. And somehow they ended up with his name on the check in the memo line, I think, or if it was direct deposited, he wrote a letter that he signed saying, here's a check. And it didn't get a whole lot of attention, but at the time, some people were sort of scratching their head, like, what a stupid, ridiculous thing. To pretend that the money was somehow personally coming from Trump, as opposed to, a decision of the federal government. But when journalists went into Southern Texas, where some of these almost entirely Latino districts had shown surprising strength for Trump in 2020, they said to people, why would you vote for Trump now? And some of the people, these Latinos in Texas, in these little sort of rural areas along the border, said, when I got my check from the stimulus, it was from him, and I knew he cared about me. So that's one way that there's a kind of sense of that he established to more working class voters, this kind of proximity is this, through this boss politics. But another really big thing is honor culture. And he embodies honor culture. And honor culture for a scholar is a way of, it's a kind of culture in which people, particularly men, have to maintain a reputation for toughness. They have to show that they won't be pushed around, they won't be insulted, and that if you do in any way, not just threaten them, but even kind of insult them, they are going to punch back hard. And some of these places, women are also supposed to be tough. And honor cultures have been found, it was part of the history of the US South. It was part of the Italian-American immigrants that came to this country and settled in places like Johnston, Rhode Island. It's common in many Latino cultures that, that both in Latin America, but also in immigrant communities here. It's common really everywhere except in places like New York City and Claremont, California. This emphasis on maintaining a reputation for toughness and sort of a willingness to even use violence if need be to protect oneself or establish one's boundaries. And Trump did this all the time. So one of his famous things was, he was getting hecklers and protesters at rallies. And he said, in 2016, he said, among many things, if you see someone getting ready to throw a tomato, because I guess there was some of that sort of thing. If you see someone getting ready to throw a tomato, knock him out, would you? And he often has this kind of attitude. When Bob Woodward interviewed him, and that he came out with that book, and he said, real power is fear or strength. You have to show strength. You can't show weakness. You never apologize. That's all sort of typical behavior in an honor culture. And that was just pervasive in the communities that we studied. Not only was it something that was channeled by the elites, by the local leaders, but also on the grassroots. So example, in Ottumwa, there was a man who was very powerful in local politics, remains a figure of local politics, named Jerry Parker. And Jerry Parker in 2016 was an advocate for Hillary Clinton. And at the Democratic meeting, like many Democratic community meetings leading up to the election, there was a struggle between the pro-Clinton and the pro-Sanders factions of the local Democratic Party there. And but this was Ottumwa. So when it flared into open conflict, the head, Jerry Parker, head of the Clinton faction, got up in the face of a man named Alex Stroda, head of the Sanders faction, and it was like they were gonna fight. It was and Alex Stroda told us, he said it would have probably been like a chest bump that we did, but we're both a little overweight, so it was a belly bump. So they were like belly bumping over the Clinton Sanders division, and that's honor culture. But it also happens at the grassroots, right? So we talked to a woman in Iowa who told us she had worked in corn processing plants her whole life. I'm thinking actually of a different quote. There's a woman she was a trucker actually, which is an unusual occupation for a woman. And she said, I love Trump. I love Trump for his strength. He reminds me of Muhammad Ali. He has this braggadocio and people love Muhammad Ali for that. And I love Trump for that. And that kind of emphasis on Trump is a strong man. Trump has balls. He never backs down. He doesn't apologize. That kind of language was everywhere. So that I think it gave working class white Democrats, a sense that he's like, oh, as one person put it beautifully, he said, well, Trump is a rich guy, but he's a rich regular guy. So I think that so Trump was a master of signaling through style and culture a kind of social proximity to people he's much wealthier than, that gave them a feeling that he understands them, he thinks like them, and I think on some level will represent them. Yeah.
And do you think he actually does? I know it's almost like psychoanalyzing Trump, but I don't want to attribute anything, I don't want to insult him unnecessarily, but it could, again, to a person from New York, doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, sometimes you could perceive somebody that's way, way, way wealthier than you, and they speak a certain way. I'm imagining Trump showing up to like Madison Square Park in New York and saying what he says in Pennsylvania or somewhere else, right? And it just wouldn't sit well with people. Like
right.
New Yorkers wouldn't, New York City, people from New York City just wouldn't trust that. They would look at him and be like, well, he's kind of a pompous prick, and we're just gonna dismiss him. But it's interesting that to Democrats as well, from a different part of the country, he was kind of like a hero, and I don't want to, it sounds almost like a savior.
Yeah, no, I do think they saw him as someone who would truly represent truly represent them. He had been a figure of admiration from long before he ever got involved in politics, right? He was, one man in Rhode Island said to us, he was a middle-aged guy. He said, I've been to Trump's casinos. I've seen his, I've been in his hotels, and it seems to me like everywhere Trump goes, everything Trump touches turns to gold. And I wish he would touch our country and turn it to gold. He had this kind of admiration. But also, speaking of the honor culture, there's a long history in rap music of idolizing Trump before he got into politics. You could go on YouTube and find people have now compiled all the different rappers who, praise Trump in their rap music, precisely for this kind of invocation of honor culture, his machismo and his showiness. His sort of seems to represent the American dream, a businessman who rose not through professional ladders of increasing education, but through supposedly his own entrepreneurial toughness and cleverness. So in that way, he was kind of a heroic figure, and I think these voters felt like he would represent them, and in the sense that our politics for all voters are becoming increasingly a matter of our social identity. This is not unique to Trump voters, to Trump Democrats, or anything. All of us in this country, there's been a lot of good work on very few voters are really policy voters. More and more, we're sort of in our tribes, in our political tribes, which touch back on many different features of our identities. And so in that sense, they're not wrong, right? That one of the problems with Obama wasn't his race, it was that he seems like a con law professor. And certainly Clinton seemed very much, part of this professional class. I think Biden actually did a better job of seeming more like an ordinary Joe, so to speak, and at least being able to present himself that way. And so I think, I don't think that Trump was, when you say, did he really represent them? Usually people mean, did he do the economic policies that we think are necessary for working class voters? And I'm not a Trump supporter, so I would say no. But nobody's really voting quite that way anymore, and my educated circles aren't either. And so if people know best who seems to represent them as a kind of symbol of their identity, it's hard to argue with somebody who's relating on these in these ways. I mean, and certainly part of the reason that people in my circles loved Obama was precisely because he talked like a con law professor, and that made us, there was a wonderful comedian, John Mulaney, who said, he has this bit about how he said, well, people said to me, there are bad things that Obama did too, or Obama did the same thing. Why are people not criticizing Obama for doing things that, maybe like deportations and things that they criticized Trump for? And he said, well, when Obama was president, I wasn't paying attention because he seemed like he would be pretty good at his job. And it was a very honest statement. He somehow signaled that he was of a certain kind of professional class and that he could handle all this. And so I think in the same way, Trump signals to these working class voters that he's sympathetic to how they see the world and how they interact with the world. And so will somehow embody their deepest values, in his presidency.
Yeah, and I feel like that hasn't been lost 4 years since he's gotten elected, right? So 4 years later, he's still got over 71 million votes, and I don't think these districts viewed him any different than they viewed him 4 years ago. They still saw him as a guiding light for this country in some ways. One of the interesting analysis that you have in your book is of political correctness. And I think in intellectual circles, maybe on university campuses and in major publications across the country, whether Democrats or Republicans, people always discuss political correctness. And it's interesting to me that the people you're describing, you're talking about, don't seem to care too much about it because it is an intellectual debate, right? But it's not a debate that kind of, and I think you mentioned this, where if they were to show up at a college campus, they would be kind of disgusted by some of the things that they see, but most of them won't have to encounter anything like that. So they don't really care too much about it. Why is it not a debate that's limited only to why is it a debate that's only limited to the intellectuals in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just the way the kind of conversations that they're tuning into, as you rightly point out, are not the kind of conversations that are happening on college campuses. So they haven't heard about microaggressions and things like that. And now they've certainly, some of the big discussions they're tuned into over abortion, for instance, or gay rights and things like that. But the larger conversation about political correctness is pretty just not something that they are really familiar with. But the kind of conversations they have to do with, partly with the kind of, when you ask them about what kind of values, or when you observe the kind of values they have, for example, another whole piece of what they're responding to, or what they responded to in Trump, has to do with a kind of value system that takes place very seriously. So political correctness tends to be about race, it tends to be about gender, it tends to be about sexual minorities and concern for that kind of inclusiveness. It totally is it's a very deracinated conversation that doesn't take place in any particular, without any sensitivity to any sort of borders or geography. But they live in a world where one of the important sort of political moral issues has to do with the fact that these are very locally rooted people, and that their identities as Ottumwans, as Johnstonians, as Elliott Countyans, as Kentuckians, as Rhode Islanders, etc., has tremendous civic, moral, and political weight for them. And so, and these kinds of identities can sometimes include people that are of particular concerns in conversations about political correctness. So it can include local Black residents. It can include local gay residents. It can include, it can even include some immigration, I think, some local immigrants in their communities. But it's still bounded by this sense of geography that's completely absent from the political correctness conversations. And so what I mean, for example, is that in Ottumwa, we had people say things like, you got to buy things here instead of going to Des Moines to do your shopping, because local dollars need to stay local. Or in Elliott County, there was a school system job that came available, like a very good one, like superintendent or something. And the school board, this is a very small rural county. There's not a lot of people who are qualified to be the superintendent. And they wanted to hire someone from an adjacent county that is demographically identical and like 25 minutes away for this position. And there was some controversy because they felt like Elliott County jobs are hard to come by and they should go to Elliott County people. In Johnston, there's a rec center. There's the only indoor basketball courts, I guess, in Rhode Island. And all kinds of people can come and use this public rec center that they built in Johnston, very nice one. And but when it gets really crowded there, they check for IDs because Johnstonians should get first crack over at access to Johnston goods over, let's say, somebody from Providence, which is, adjacent, or Cranston, which is adjacent. So there's that intense sense of localism. One funny example was when I was in Elliott County, there had been a critical article about something happening in Elliott County and something about some typical story about Appalachian poverty. And the man telling me about this story said when they took a picture to illustrate the story, it was some ramshackle trailer. He said that wasn't in Elliott County. That was, it was a few miles outside of Elliott County. And now, to many people, it doesn't look very different, right? But to him, it was like, why would you say that county's problems is our county's problems, right? We are Elliott Countyans. And sometimes it does scale up, of course. So in Rhode Island, we heard people complaining at the time about now she's in the administration, Gina Raimondo, the then governor of Rhode Island. She had gotten a reputation for staffing up the State House with people from other places. And somebody said to us, she's bringing in people from Connecticut. She's bringing in people from New York. What's wrong with Rhode Island people? We got no smart people in Rhode Island. And so here was someone from Rhode Island, concerned about some white person from Connecticut. And if you just think about the categories that political correctness is interested in, you miss how important that geographical boundary is, And of course, in Ottumwa, it can even scale up larger because Ottumwa was a union town. And there was there's a John Deere plant there still. The UAW was a very powerful union there. And people still look to see who manufactured your car. There was one local politician who had bought a Kia, And she said, she felt like she was in danger of losing the election because she was driving around town in a Kia. And people are like, why are you driving in a Kia? You buy American. So it's these sort of circles of community and obligation that radiate out from their local community, and that really forms their sort of political, civic, and moral imaginations. And so I think it's just a very different conversation than the one that we're having, let's say here at Claremont colleges or in New York City.
Yeah. To begin, maybe wrapping up this conversation a little bit, what are some lessons, and based on your book and based on the conversation we're having, it doesn't have to be policy initiatives, because I feel like it's almost the easiest thing to talk about. We should have an infrastructure plan and this plan and that plan. What can both parties learn from your work, and how can they actually implement it to help the people that they're supposedly trying to help?
Yeah, it's a big question. So I think one thing is what my book can offer people, what John in my book offers people, is a way to build some theory, to make some sense of things that otherwise are really hard to wrap our minds around. So one of the most obvious things to me is this sort of stunning development in the 2020 election, where Democratic support among Latinos dropped something like 8 or 9% across the board, more intensely in some localities than others, et cetera. But I was just reading an interview with David Shore, who crunches all these numbers, and he was saying, look, the drop in Latino support was countrywide, and it was, significant. It also appears that there was some erosion of African-American support, less so, but and also of Asian support. That appears to be the case, Asian American support. And it's hard to make sense of it. I think if people don't take class seriously, and not just class when it comes to policy, but class in terms of the kind of signaling with honor culture, that kind of class seriously. I do think Biden took some of that seriously in 2020. Some of the things that got called a gaffe. So, for example, there was one bizarre episode where he's at some meeting and somebody attacked Hunter Biden and he called him a liar. And then they got into some altercation. I don't remember exactly the conversation, but Biden ended up saying, challenging him to a push-up contest. And people, in my class was sort of embarrassed by this. Like, what's this guy doing? Like, this is bizarre behavior. But I think Biden knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly who he was talking to. He comes from Scranton and Scranton, right? He comes from these sort of white working class communities, and in Delaware, he's familiar with it. And so he knew better than some of the other recent Democratic candidates how to talk that talk and how to show people that he understood and could relate to them. So I think, I hope that the theory building would help Democrats to sort of make sense of some of the data. I think to encourage them to take these kinds of sort of class cultural cleavages seriously and deal with them sort of respectfully. I think Biden made a good start. I think for the GOP, the advice is that these are not voters that are going to thrill at a libertarian style agenda. They really are economically much closer to Democrats than to their own sort of donor class. So free trade, loose immigration regulation, all kinds of policies like that are just going to leave them cold. And this goes back to the sort of America First language that Trump used. And in fact, in Johnston, they had a saying, a long-standing saying, which was Johnston first. And so for the Republicans, they need to be thinking about, and I think there is work to do this, how might we have, even without Trump specifically, imagine a kind of Republican Party that's a sort of conservative and pro-working class party. And I think Marco Rubio is interested in that project, and there's American Compass as sort of this, group that's trying to think this through. I think that would be a more promising direction if they want to keep these voters. Only time will tell. Certainly the charisma of Trump to these people, they found him very exciting, will be hard to it can't be captured in a series of mere policies. I think it's got to be embodied personally by an exciting candidate. And whether or not they have somebody that like that there's a lot of contenders right now in the GOP that are trying to show that they can be Trump's heir. So time will tell.
Yeah. And so my last question for all my guests is, what are 5 books on any topic, any genre that you would recommend to anyone on any topic?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Usually throws people off a little bit.
Yeah, I should have come prepared. Well, so I'll tell you some books that I teach and that I think is great, particularly if you have listeners that are, trying to, that I think are very accessible books to think about American politics today. One of them is Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized. I think he's a fantastic guide to academic literature, and he can make academics more accessible than academics can often make themselves. So I think Why We're Polarized is a really good book. I particularly, actually, I also like a book called The Most Dangerous Branch by David Kaplan. It's a book that is against judicial overreach, but not from a conservative perspective. You often hear that argument made by conservatives, but he makes a global argument about sort of the aggrandizement of the judicial branch at the expense of particularly of Congress, from both left and right. He's a liberal making this argument. So I think that's a really interesting book. Let me think. I'm trying to look and see, of course, some things. A book that I found really, really useful. It's not quite as both of the books I just mentioned are really fun reading. They're just written in a very accessible way. There's a book called Why Cities Lose by Jonathan Roden. He's at Stanford, and he talks about how the Democrats have become the party of urban centers, and the Republicans are the parties of sort of small town, rural, and sort of disfavored cities, sort of like Ottumwa. But he shows it in a historical and international context, that these same trends are actually happening, for instance, in Canada. Even where race isn't a feature, there seems to be something about rural and urban life that are shaping people's ideology and political imaginations, certainly in the United States, but also in other places where the factors going into the politics are quite different. And it's just fascinating. Let's see, that's 3. I'm trying to think of
Give as many as you want.
There's
it could be fiction too, by the way.
Yeah, I'm thinking one of my favorite political novels, of course, is All the
King's Men.
All the King's Men, and that is a fantastic novel. If you're interested in sort of the American experience and poetry of boss politics, and how important it's been in this country. I think the Robert Penn Warren novel is just it's one of my favorite novels, and it's he captures sort of Huey Long. Of course, it's lightly fictionalized version, but it becomes this whole meditation on democratic governance in America and in the South, and I think that's a fantastic novel. And give me one more minute, see if I can come up with number 5. That one I can't recommend enough. And there's, let me think for a second. And I think, of course, I guess this one is going to be commonly cited probably, but Hillbilly Elegies, I think for people interested in this subject, is a beautifully written memoir. And I think J.D. Vance has got real political interest and aspirations. And so it's in and of itself, I think it really gives a very beautiful, poignant portrait of white working class culture and the challenges and problems that it faces today. And he may be very much on our political world. Yeah, in the coming decades. So I guess those would be my 5.
Amazing. It was such a privilege. I really, really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Sure. I really enjoyed talking to you. This was a fun conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
So thanks for having me.
Pleasure.